Imagine sitting down at a medieval feast. The hall is dimly lit by flickering torches, the air heavy with the smell of smoke, sweat, and roasting meat. At first, it might seem like a scene pulled straight from a fantasy film, but the reality of what would land on your plate and what it would do to your body might leave you running for the nearest exit. Medieval food was nothing like the carefully regulated, safety-checked meals we eat today. From questionable meat preservation to spices used not for flavor, but to mask rot, eating in the Middle Ages was both an adventure and a risk. And if you were hoping for clean water to wash it all down, you'd likely be out of luck. What they drank, how they cooked, and even the ways they seasoned their meals could challenge your stomach, and in some cases, your survival. Tonight, we're going to sink into this world of flavors, dangers, and traditions. We'll explore what people really ate during the Middle Ages, from the banquets of nobles dripping with greasy meats and sweetened wine to the hard, dark bread of peasants who lived each day wondering if they'd have enough to fill their bellies. You'll discover why food was a reflection of class, faith, and survival, and why, if you were suddenly dropped into this world, you probably wouldn't last a single day. Before we dive in, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe dim your lights, grab a blanket, and let yourself drift into the rhythm of history as we tell it here. If you enjoy this journey, please remember to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more long, soothing explorations of the past designed to ease you into rest. And I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me what part of history you're most interested in, and when you find yourself listening, whether it's late at night, during a nap, or in the middle of a restless evening. Now, let's step into the kitchens, fields, and feasting halls of the medieval world, and uncover why the food of the Middle Ages might have been the hardest part of survival. To understand why you wouldn't last a day eating medieval food, we first have to step into the world of daily life during the Middle Ages. Food was not just nourishment, it was survival, identity, and even a reflection of one's place in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. What you ate, how often you ate, and the quality of the ingredients on your plate were dictated less by taste and more by status, faith, and availability. Unlike the modern world, where a grocery store can provide everything from tropical fruit to packaged meals in every season, the medieval table was bound by seasons, climate, and the limits of preservation. For peasants, who made up the vast majority of the population, meals were plain, repetitive, and filling when possible, but rarely luxurious. Bread was the foundation of their diet, but not the soft, white loaves you might picture. Instead, the bread was coarse, dark, and dense, made from rye, barley, or oats, depending on what was available. White bread was a privilege reserved for the wealthy, and even then, it came at the expense of nutrition, since refining flour removed much of its natural goodness. Alongside bread, the common man's diet often consisted of pottage, a sort of thick stew made from grains, peas, beans, and whatever vegetables could be gathered from the fields or gardens. Meat was rare for the lower classes, consumed only on special occasions, if at all. Dairy was sometimes present in the form of cheese or milk, but these were not staples one could rely on every day. Now imagine yourself, used to the varied, seasoned, and relatively safe foods of today, suddenly handed a bowl of this pottage. It's heavy, bland, and perhaps slightly sour, flavored not with spices you might recognize, but with leeks, onions, or herbs grown locally. If you're lucky, a bit of pork fat might have been added to thicken the broth, but more often than not, the meal was simply a way to fill the stomach. Eating this day after day would quickly wear down someone accustomed to the richness and diversity of a modern diet. And remember, this is the food of survival, not comfort. At the other end of the spectrum were the nobles, who enjoyed feasts that dazzled the eye more than they delighted the palate. Their tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, game birds, fish, and pies, but these dishes were not necessarily healthier. Meat was often salted heavily to preserve it or cooked with thick sauces spiced not to enhance flavor, but to disguise the taste of food that might not be fresh. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and cloves were imported at great cost, symbols of wealth and power as much as seasonings. Eating at a noble's banquet might feel impressive at first glance, but as soon as you tasted the heavy sauces and overly sweetened wines, your modern palate might struggle. Food safety, as we know it, didn't exist. Preservation meant salting, smoking, or drying, but even these methods weren't foolproof. Meat could spoil quickly, especially in warmer seasons, and without refrigeration, the risk of foodborne illness was constant. Parasites, contaminated water, and unsanitary cooking conditions added layers of danger that most people simply accepted as a fact of life. To modern stomachs, conditioned by clean water systems and strict health codes, this would be a shock. One day of eating and drinking like a medieval villager or lord could leave you doubled over in discomfort or worse. And yet, people survived because their bodies adapted. Their expectations were shaped by necessity, and their diets reflected the world around them. Bread and pottage were enough to sustain a laborer working long hours in the fields. The nobility, though indulging in heavy feasts, also balanced their meals with fish, fruit, and grains, though still in ways that modern doctors might raise their eyebrows at. For the medieval man or woman, this was food, an expression of who they were, where they stood in society, and how close they lived to the edge of hunger. For us, it's a glimpse into a world where every meal is both nourishment and risk, and why lasting even a single day on medieval food would be a test of both stomach and spirit. One of the first shocks to a modern visitor in the medieval world would be the absence of clean, safe water. Today, we turn on a tap and rarely question whether the water will make us sick. In the Middle Ages, however, drinking water was often unsafe, especially in towns and villages, where waste disposal was rudimentary at best. Rivers and wells, the main sources of water, were easily contaminated by sewage, animal waste, and runoff from daily life. To drink water straight from these sources was to risk illness, from stomach pains and diarrhea to more serious diseases that could sweep through entire communities. Because of this, people turned to alternatives. Ale, wheat beer, and watered-down wine were far more common drinks than plain water. For peasants, ale brewed from barley or oats was the staple, consumed in large quantities throughout the day. It was low in alcohol, enough to kill harmful bacteria, but not strong enough to cause intoxication unless drunk in extreme amounts. This so-called small ale was even given to children, not as a luxury, but as a safer alternative to water. Imagine sitting down for breakfast and being handed a cup of ale instead of juice, tea, or coffee that was daily life for medieval families. For nobles and those of higher status, wine was the drink of choice, especially in regions where vineyards thrived. But even wine was not what you might imagine. It was often mixed with water to make it last longer and to mellow its strength. Sweeteners, spices, and herbs were sometimes added, both for flavor and for supposed medicinal properties. Drinking wine at every meal was a sign of wealth, but even then, it was more about safety than indulgence. The act of boiling water for tea or coffee, which became common centuries later, was not part of medieval life, meaning fermentation was their best defense against disease. If you were to step into this world, the shock would come not only from what you drank, but how much. Hydration was essential, especially for laborers in the fields, and the average medieval peasant could consume several liters of ale in a single day. To a modern person, unused to this constant intake of fermented beverages, it would feel overwhelming. The taste, too, would be different, thicker, cloudier, and far less refined than the crisp lagers or wines of today. You might find it unpleasant, even hard to swallow, but for them, it was the drink of life. The lack of clean water also shaped cooking. Broths and stews were often made with ale instead of water, giving a sour or yeasty flavor to meals. Sauces might be thickened with wine, vinegar, or fermented dairy. Even bread could be made with ale yeast, adding another layer of that distinctive taste. Everything from the morning meal to the evening feast bore traces of this dependence on fermented liquids. To our taste buds, trained on filtered water, soda, coffee, or juice, this would feel alien, heavy, and difficult to enjoy. This reliance on ale and wine highlights an important truth about medieval food and drink: survival-dictated choices. What was safe to consume was what people consumed, regardless of flavor or preference. If you tried to last a day in their shoes, the absence of clean water and the constant substitution of alcohol-based drinks might leave you reeling. You'd likely crave the refreshing clarity of modern water, but in the Middle Ages, that simple luxury was out of reach. Instead, you'd have to adapt quickly or risk sickness that could end your experiment in medieval dining long before the day was over. If you were to sit at a medieval table, the most noticeable difference from modern dining would be the bread. Today, bread comes in countless forms: fluffy white loaves, multigrain slices, baguettes, and soft rolls, all uniform, carefully baked and enriched with nutrients. In the Middle Ages, bread was not just food. It was survival, and its quality depended entirely on where you stood in society. The wealthy ate fine white bread, known as manchet, made from carefully sifted wheat flour. Its pale color was not only a sign of refinement, but also a symbol of status. To eat white bread was to show the world that you had money and connections, since wheat was expensive and refining flour required more labor. Peasants, on the other hand, rarely tasted such luxuries. Their bread was dark, coarse, and dense, made from rye, barley, oats, or a mixture of whatever grains were available. Known as maslin bread, it was hearty but heavy, often flavored with the sour tang of fermentation. Sometimes, when harvests failed or grain was scarce, fillers like ground acorns, beans, or even tree bark were added to stretch the dough. These additions made the bread harder to digest, and sometimes even harmful, yet hunger left little room for choice. Imagine biting into a slice of bread so dense and gritty it felt more like eating compressed soil than food. That was the reality for countless medieval villagers. Another curious use of bread was the trencher, a thick, stale slice used as both plate and utensil. At feasts, stews and meats were piled onto trenchers, which soaked up the juices. When the meal was finished, the soggy bread might be eaten, fed to dogs, or given to the poor. To us, it may sound unappetizing to eat from a bread plate, but for medieval diners, this practice was both practical and symbolic. It showed how central bread was to their diet and culture. Every meal, no matter how humble or extravagant, was anchored by bread. For modern eaters, the lack of variety would be a challenge. Bread in the Middle Ages was not an option among many choices. It was the foundation of nearly every meal. Breakfast might consist of bread dipped in ale or milk. Lunch and dinner would feature bread alongside pottage, meat, or cheese. Without bread, most people would have gone hungry. And while our bodies crave variety and balance, theirs were built around this single staple. If you suddenly had to live on medieval bread, you would quickly notice the heaviness, the lack of nutrients compared to modern fortified flour, and the sheer monotony. There was also the danger of ergot, a fungus that grew on rye and could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and even death. Entire communities sometimes suffered outbreaks of what was later called St. Anthony's fire, all from contaminated bread. Eating in the Middle Ages meant living with this kind of risk, often unknowingly. For you, trying to survive on their bread for even a day, the gritty texture, sour taste, and potential for illness would be a shock. What they accepted as daily life would feel like a grueling endurance test for someone used to light, fluffy slices from a supermarket. Bread was life, but it was also a reminder of just how fragile survival could be in the medieval world. If bread was the backbone of the medieval diet, then pottage was its companion, so constant and essential that it was almost impossible to imagine a meal without it. Pottage was a thick, slow-cooked mixture of grains, legumes, and vegetables, simmered over a fire for hours until everything blended into a hearty, filling stew. For the peasant majority, this dish was eaten daily, sometimes for every meal, and its ingredients varied according to what was available. In times of plenty, it might include beans, peas, leeks, onions, or cabbage. In leaner times, it could be nothing more than watery broth, thickened with oats or barley. Pottage was not meant to delight the palate, but to provide the calories needed to survive long hours of labor in the fields. Imagine waking up to the same bowl of pottage every morning, day after day. The flavor, though nourishing, was monotonous, earthy, slightly sour, sometimes smoky if it had been left over the fire too long. Meat was a rare addition, perhaps a bit of bacon fat or a bone to flavor the broth. But for most peasants, meat in pottage was a luxury reserved for festivals or special occasions. Instead, they relied on vegetables they could grow themselves and whatever grains the harvest provided. It was a diet designed for survival, not variety, and for someone used to endless options, the sameness would become almost unbearable. Even nobles, despite their wealth, ate pottage, though theirs was enriched with far more extravagant ingredients. A lord's pottage might contain venison, rabbit, or exotic spices like saffron and ginger, turning the humble dish into something resembling a delicacy. Thickened with almonds or enriched with cream, noble pottages could be complex and flavorful. Yet even in these lavish versions, the dish remained heavy, dense, and far different from the lighter soups or stews we enjoy today. Whether rich or poor, pottage was a shared reality, binding all levels of society to this one essential food. What would make pottage most difficult for a modern person to endure is the lack of variety. Today, when we grow tired of one meal, we simply reach for another option, something spicy, sweet, or completely different in texture. In medieval times, choice was limited, and monotony was accepted as a fact of life. Eating the same thick stew every day would quickly test your patience, no matter how hungry you were. And unlike our modern diets, which often emphasize balance and nutrients, medieval pottage could be lacking in key vitamins, especially during the winter months when fresh vegetables were scarce. Malnutrition was common, and the body suffered from deficiencies that today would be easily avoided with supplements or diverse foods. The cooking process itself was also vastly different. Pottage was often left simmering over an open fire in an iron pot, sometimes for days, with new ingredients added as they became available. This meant flavors could grow sour, and the stew might take on an intensity that modern palates would find unpleasant. Hygiene, too, was questionable. Utensils and pots were not cleaned as thoroughly as today, and contamination was always a possibility. For someone used to carefully stored leftovers in a refrigerator, eating from a pot that had been bubbling for days would be both strange and unsettling. Pottage tells us a great deal about the resilience and resourcefulness of medieval people. They took what little they had and transformed it into something that could sustain life, even if it lacked excitement. But for us, stepping into their world, the endless repetition, the heaviness, and the risk of illness would quickly make us long for the simple luxury of a varied and balanced meal. One bowl might be manageable, but to eat pottage for every meal would be the true test of whether you could last even a single day in the medieval diet. When people imagine medieval food, they often think of great roasting spits turning over open flames, dripping with meat and fat. And while this image is partly true for the wealthy, the reality of meat in the Middle Ages was far less glamorous for the average person. For peasants, meat was a rare treat, something consumed only on feast days or when an animal was slaughtered for special occasions. Most of the year, they survived on grains, vegetables, and dairy, with perhaps the occasional bit of salted pork or scraps of offal. Meat was expensive, difficult to preserve, and tightly controlled by the laws of the land, leaving the lower classes with little access to it. For nobles, however, meat was a symbol of power and prestige. Their tables overflowed with roasted boar, venison, swan, and even peacock, often served with elaborate sauces designed to impress as much as to nourish. These feasts displayed not only wealth, but also dominance, since hunting rights were reserved for the elite. To kill a deer in a lord's forest as a commoner was a serious crime, sometimes punishable by mutilation or death. This divide meant that what you ate or didn't eat was a constant reminder of where you stood in the medieval hierarchy. For us, used to supermarkets stocked with affordable chicken, beef, and pork, the scarcity of meat for peasants and the excess of it for nobles would feel alien and extreme. But even noble meat was not the savory delight one might expect. Without refrigeration, preservation was key. Meat was salted, smoked, or dried, but these methods altered its flavor and texture. Salted meat was tough, overly briny, and often had to be soaked before it could be eaten. Smoked meat carried a strong, almost overwhelming taste, and dried meat could be leathery and hard to chew. When fresh meat was available, it was often cooked with heavy spices and sauces, not to enhance its flavor, but to mask the fact that it might not be entirely fresh. In a world where food spoiled quickly, covering up bad taste was as important as cooking itself. As sauces themselves were unusual to our palates. Instead of the light gravies or marinades we know today, medieval sauces often combined strong spices, vinegar, and even sugar, creating odd, heavy mixtures that were as much about showing off wealth as pleasing the tongue. Imagine biting into a piece of venison drenched in a sauce made of pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and honey. To a medieval noble, this was a sign of refinement and status. To a modern eater, it might feel overpowering, strange, and difficult to stomach. For peasants, when they did have access to meat, it was usually pork. Pigs were easier to raise than cattle and provided fat, which was just as important as the meat itself. Lard was used in cooking, not only for flavor, but because it added vital calories to otherwise plain dishes. Offal, liver, heart, lungs, and stomach was also eaten, since nothing could go to waste. These cuts, often discarded or avoided today, were a regular part of the medieval diet. If you were handed a bowl of stew, made with sheep's lungs or pig intestines, you might hesitate. But for them, it was nourishment they could not afford to refuse. The difficulty for a modern person would not just be the rarity or abundance of meat, but the taste and texture. Our palates are shaped by freshness, balance, and variety, while theirs were shaped by survival and necessity. Salty, smoky, tough, or strange in flavor, medieval meat would test your endurance as much as your appetite. To eat like a noble might leave you sick from heaviness and richness, while to eat like a peasant would leave you hungry, yearning for more substance. Either way, lasting a day on medieval meat would prove far more challenging than the romantic images suggest. Fish played a central role in the medieval diet, but not because it was always preferred. Its importance was rooted in religion. The Christian calendar dictated that meat from land animals could not be eaten on certain days, Fridays, Lent, and numerous feast days scattered throughout the year. This meant that nearly half the calendar was marked by restrictions, pushing people to rely on fish as a primary source of protein. For peasants and nobles alike, fish became not just food, but a religious obligation. To skip it was to risk being seen as unfaithful or disobedient to the church's rules. For those living near rivers, lakes, or the sea, fresh fish was more accessible, though it still came with challenges. Without refrigeration, fish spoiled quickly, and unless you lived within a short distance of water, what you consumed was unlikely to be fresh. Preservation methods like salting, smoking, or drying were used, but these altered the flavor dramatically. Salted fish was often rock hard, requiring hours of soaking before it could be cooked. Dried fish had a leathery texture, while smoked fish carried an intensely sharp taste. Eating these preserved varieties was more about endurance than pleasure, and to a modern eater, they would feel overly salty, tough, or bitter. One of the most common fish was herring, especially in northern Europe. Vast fisheries supplied salted and pickled herring across the continent, making it a staple in both humble and noble households. Eel was also popular, surprisingly abundant in rivers and ponds. Nobles, on the other hand, enjoyed more exotic catches, sturgeon, salmon, or even whale meat in some coastal regions, each prepared with elaborate sauces that attempted to mask the preservation methods. Yet, even the wealthiest lord's fish would not resemble the fresh fillets or carefully seasoned dishes we know today. Instead, the overwhelming taste of salt, vinegar, and spice would dominate every bite. For peasants, fish was often boiled into pottage or stewed with grains and vegetables. The preservation methods left the meat tough, and the flavors were strong, but it was filling. To eat fish this way was to accept a diet that felt more like medicine than enjoyment. Imagine chewing through a salty, leathery piece of fish, softened only by soaking, then simmered into a stew with barley and cabbage. The nourishment was there, but the taste was far from appetizing. For those accustomed to modern seafood, with its delicate textures and fresh flavors, medieval fish would feel almost inedible. The reliance on fish also reflected the constant presence of religion in daily life. Food was not simply about hunger, but about obedience, penance, and spiritual discipline. To eat fish instead of meat was to demonstrate devotion, even if the taste was unpleasant. For us, the idea of letting faith dictate our meals might feel restrictive, but for them, it was an unquestioned part of life. This discipline, however, came at a cost to the body. Salt-heavy diets strained the kidneys, and the lack of variety during fasting periods left many malnourished. If you were to live by medieval dietary rules, half your meals would revolve around fish, preserved in ways that stripped it of freshness and layered it with harsh flavors. It would not take long before you longed for something simple, clean and fresh: a grilled fillet, a piece of sushi, or even a fish sandwich. Instead, you'd be left with salty, smoky slabs of preserved meat that tested your endurance more than they satisfied your hunger. This, too, is why surviving a single day on medieval food would feel like an ordeal, because even the fish, meant to sustain, could so quickly become a burden. If bread and pottage were the backbone of medieval diets, and meat or fish appeared as occasional luxuries, then vegetables and legumes filled in the rest. Yet the vegetables available, and the way they were prepared, would surprise anyone expecting the variety and freshness of a modern grocery store. Today, we think of vegetables as essential for health, providing vitamins and balance. But in the Middle Ages, they were seen as lower-class food. Nobles often looked down on them, considering vegetables fit only for peasants, while the poor depended on them daily as a means of survival. This class-based distinction created a curious divide in medieval dining, where something as simple as cabbage could mark you as either humble or desperate. The most common vegetables were hardy, durable crops that could withstand less favorable conditions. Onions, leeks, garlic, and cabbages appeared regularly in peasant pottage. Root vegetables such as turnips, parsnips, and carrots, though not the orange carrots we know today, they were usually purple, yellow, or white, were also staples. Beans and peas, both fresh and dried, played a major role, providing much-needed protein when meat was unavailable. Lentils were especially important, though they were sometimes associated with poverty because of their humble, earthy taste. For a peasant family, however, beans or lentils stewed with barley or cabbage might be the difference between surviving the winter or starving. One difficulty for a modern person would be the monotony. Without refrigeration, vegetables had to be eaten in season or preserved in limited ways. Cabbage, leeks, and onions could last through the colder months, but greens were scarce in winter, leading to months of dull, repetitive meals. Imagine eating cabbage nearly every day for half the year, not as a fresh, crisp salad, but boiled into the same pottage pot that had been simmering for days. The texture would be soft, almost mushy, and the flavor deeply sulfurous. It was filling, yes, but hardly enjoyable. Our modern expectations for freshness, crunch, and variety would quickly clash with this heavy sameness. Peasants made use of every part of the plant they could. Leaves, roots, and stems all went into the pot, because nothing could be wasted. Herbs such as parsley, dill, and sage were added when available, but not in the bright aromatic quantities we use today. They were grown in small household gardens or gathered from the wild, and their primary purpose was medicinal as much as culinary. A sprig of sage might be thrown into the pot not just to add flavor, but because it was believed to strengthen the body or ward off illness. This overlap of food and medicine shaped medieval cooking, giving many dishes a taste profile that would seem odd to modern palates. For nobles, vegetables were not entirely absent, but they were often used more as garnishes or in complex sauces than as the heart of a meal. Wealthy households had access to gardens where rarer vegetables such as asparagus, spinach, or even imported artichokes could appear. These would be prepared in ways designed to impress, perhaps stewed with almonds, flavored with exotic spices, or sweetened with honey. Yet even then, vegetables never carried the prestige of meat or fish. A nobleman might enjoy them in moderation, but to rely on vegetables too heavily risked appearing poor or common. Food, after all, was about status as much as sustenance. Another challenge for a modern eater would be the way vegetables were preserved. Pickling was common, with vinegar or brine used to store turnips, cabbage, or cucumbers for later use. These pickled vegetables were sharp, sour, and sometimes overpowering, especially when eaten without balance. Fermentation was also used, creating early forms of sauerkraut or other preserved greens. While we might appreciate these flavors in small amounts today, in the medieval world, they were survival strategies, not culinary choices. Eating heavily pickled or fermented vegetables every day would quickly overwhelm the palate. Legumes, especially dried beans and peas, were another foundation of the medieval diet. They were cheap, abundant, and nutritious, though they carried their own drawbacks. Without proper soaking and cooking, they could be tough and difficult to digest, leading to stomach discomfort. Medieval cooking methods, which often left food simmering for long periods, helped soften them. But even so, the heavy reliance on beans and peas created a diet that was both filling and monotonous. To a laborer in the fields, this was fuel for survival. To us, used to variety and balance, it would feel like an endless cycle of blandness and heaviness. For children, vegetables and legumes were often the main source of food, as meat was scarce. Many grew up never tasting more than a scrap of bacon or a bit of fish until festival days. Their daily lives were fueled by cabbage stews, bean porridges, and rye bread. Malnutrition was common, especially when harvests failed and gardens yielded little. Diseases linked to vitamin deficiencies, such as scurvy, were real threats, though often misunderstood at the time. To eat like a medieval child for just a day might leave a modern person unsatisfied, hungry for variety, and perhaps even queasy from the strong, repetitive flavors. The cultural perception of vegetables as lowly foods also influenced medical thinking. Physicians of the time, guided by the theory of humors, believed certain vegetables could unbalance the body. For example, cucumbers and melons were thought to cause excessive moisture and weaken the stomach, while beans were sometimes warned against for causing flatulence and ill temper. Despite these beliefs, people continued to eat them out of necessity, though always with the sense that they were less desirable than bread, meat, or fish. Imagine yourself at a medieval peasant's table. Before you is a wooden bowl filled with a steaming mass of pottage, made with cabbage, beans, and barley. The smell is pungent, earthy, and slightly sour. The bread beside it is dense and dark, perhaps with a crust that tastes faintly of smoke from the hearth. There are no bright salads, no variety of textures, no bursts of sweetness to break up the heaviness. You dip your spoon, taste the stew, and feel its weight sit in your stomach. Now imagine eating that same dish, or some small variation of it, every day for weeks, months, even years. This was the reality for millions of medieval people. For us, vegetables are a way to create balance, color, and freshness on the plate. For medieval people, they were simply survival foods, oiled until soft, mixed into the same pot, and consumed out of necessity. The monotony, heaviness, and sheer repetitiveness would test the patience of a modern eater, especially one accustomed to global cuisines, refrigeration, and endless choice. To last even a single day eating vegetables and legumes as they did would not only challenge your palate, but also your endurance. It was not just about eating, it was about adapting to a rhythm of life where survival mattered more than pleasure, and where every bite was a reminder of how different their world was from ours. If there is one aspect of medieval dining that would truly overwhelm a modern eater, it is the use of spices. Today, spices are everyday items, found in nearly every kitchen cabinet and available at affordable prices. We add pepper, cinnamon, nutmeg, or ginger to enhance the flavor of dishes, sometimes even without thinking about the history behind them. But in the Middle Ages, spices were treasures rare, expensive, and often worth more than gold. They were traded along long, dangerous routes from Asia and the Middle East, passing through countless merchants before arriving in Europe. To place cinnamon on your table, or to flavor a dish with saffron, was to signal immense wealth and status, something few could afford. For nobles, spices became more than flavorings. They were symbols of prestige. A heavily spiced dish showed that you had money, influence, and access to the farthest corners of the world. This led to a culinary culture where spices were sometimes used in overwhelming quantities, not for balance, but for display. Imagine sitting at a feast and being served roasted venison drenched in a sauce thick with pepper, cloves, and cinnamon. To our palates, it might taste overpowering or even unpleasant, the sweetness of cinnamon clashing with the gaminess of the meat. But to the medieval noble, this was sophistication, an edible form of wealth. Pepper was among the most prized, often measured out grain by grain. Ginger and cinnamon were also highly valued, imported from distant lands and reserved for the most prestigious tables. Saffron, with its vibrant golden hue, was used not only for flavor, but also for its striking color, turning sauces and breads into shimmering displays of opulence. Nutmeg and cloves, rare and costly, were likewise reserved for the wealthy. These spices did more than change taste. They transformed food into a symbol of global trade and aristocratic power. But spices also had practical uses, though not ones we would appreciate today. In a world without refrigeration, meat and fish often spoiled quickly, even with salting or smoking. Strong spices could mask unpleasant odors or tastes, making questionable food seem more palatable. A medieval diner, used to such flavors, may not have noticed the underlying rot, but a modern eater would detect it immediately. The heavy spice mixtures, designed to hide flaws, would feel cloying and strange. What was meant to be luxurious might instead leave you queasy. For peasants, spices were virtually non-existent. Their meals were flavored with local herbs like parsley, sage, dill, or mustard seed, which were affordable and easy to grow. The bright, aromatic spices of the East were beyond their reach. At most, a peasant might taste pepper once or twice in a lifetime, perhaps sprinkled on bread or added sparingly to a stew during a festival. Their pottage remained earthy, flavored with leeks or onions, while the nobility enjoyed dishes drenched in exotic blends. This divide reinforced the social gulf between rich and poor, with spices standing as edible markers of privilege. One unusual aspect of medieval spice use was the combination of flavors we would find strange today. Sweet and savory often mingled in ways that might surprise us. Meats could be cooked with sugar, cinnamon, and raisins, creating dishes that tasted closer to dessert by modern standards. Almond milk was frequently used in sauces, mixed with saffron and ginger to create thick, fragrant coatings for fish or poultry. Pies might contain both meat and fruit, seasoned with cloves and pepper. To the medieval noble, this was refined cuisine. To us, it might taste confused, sweet when we expect savory, or harshly spiced when we crave balance. Another factor was the medicinal value ascribed to spices. Guided by the theory of the four humors, medieval physicians believed spices could balance the body's inner elements. Pepper was thought to warm the body, ginger to aid digestion, and cinnamon to strengthen the heart. These beliefs influenced not just medicine, but cooking itself. A dish might be spiced not because it tasted good, but because it was thought to be healthy, correcting an imbalance of cold or wet humors. For us, accustomed to cooking primarily for pleasure, eating food designed for medical purposes would feel unusual, even alien. The economics of spices also cannot be ignored. A pound of pepper could cost the equivalent of weeks of labor for a peasant. Wars were fought over spice routes, and cities grew wealthy from controlling trade. To sit at a noble's feast, surrounded by dishes shimmering with saffron or perfumed with cinnamon, was to witness the reach of global commerce in every bite. Yet this luxury also distorted flavor, creating dishes so heavily seasoned that the natural taste of the food was lost. To modern palates, trained on balance and subtlety, such meals would feel overwhelming. Imagine yourself at a banquet. Before you is a plate of roasted goose, its skin lacquered with honey and dusted with cinnamon. Next to it is a pie filled with minced pork, raisins, and cloves. The wine in your cup is sweetened and spiced with nutmeg. At first, the flavors are intriguing, even exotic. But after a few bites, the sweetness becomes cloying, the spice is too strong, the heaviness overwhelming. Your stomach churns, unused to such combinations. The very flavors meant to impress you begin to wear you down. For the medieval noble, this was refinement. For you, it might feel more like punishment. Meanwhile, if you sat at a peasant's table, you would find none of this. Their food was plain, seasoned only with salt when available, and flavored with the occasional leek, mustard, or parsley. Their meals might lack excitement, but they were at least honest in taste. For them, spices were distant dreams, symbols of a world they could never reach. To taste the food of a noble might be awe-inspiring, but for survival, the humble herbs of the commoner were more reliable. And yet, both extremes would challenge a modern eater, the peasant's monotony and the noble's excesses, each difficult in its own way. Ultimately, medieval spices reveal the strangeness of their dining culture. They were not just flavors, but symbols of wealth, faith, medicine, and global power. To eat as a medieval noble was to consume the world's farthest corners in every bite, even if the result was overpowering. To eat as a peasant was to live without those luxuries, surviving instead on the earthiness of local plants. For you trying to last a day in this world, the extremes would be difficult to endure. The heavy, clashing spice blends of the wealthy might sicken you, while the plainness of the poor would quickly bore your palate. Either way, one day of medieval spices and herbs would test not just your taste buds, but your tolerance for a very different kind of food culture. If there is one element of medieval food that would shock a modern person, more than the heaviness of the bread, the monotony of pottage, or even the overwhelming spices of noble feasts, it would be the quality of preservation. Without refrigeration, without vacuum sealing, without the luxury of canned goods or frozen storage, medieval people faced a constant battle against spoilage. Their solutions, salting, smoking, pickling, and drying, were ingenious for the time. But to us, the results would taste harsh, strange, and sometimes downright unpleasant. Preservation was not about flavor, it was about survival. The choice was simple: eat salted, smoked, or pickled food, or risk starvation when fresh supplies ran out. Salt was the most important preservative, and its value cannot be overstated. Whole economies depended on salt, entire cities grew wealthy from its trade, and wars were fought to control its sources. Meat and fish were often packed in salt, drawing out moisture and preventing bacterial growth. But the process transformed the food. Imagine biting into a piece of salted pork after it had been stored for weeks, tough, briny, and dry. It often had to be soaked in water for hours, sometimes days, before it was even edible. Even then, the taste was overwhelmingly salty, a far cry from the delicate seasoning we use today. To medieval people, this was normal. To us, it would feel like eating jerky, taken to an extreme, harsh on the tongue, exhausting on the body, and difficult to stomach in large quantities. Smoking was another key method. Meat or fish hung over smoldering fires absorbed the smoke, gaining both preservation and flavor. While we may enjoy smoked salmon or bacon today, the medieval version was far more intense. The smoky taste was often overpowering, and the food itself could be leathery and dry. It lacked the balance and refinement of modern smoked foods, which are carefully timed and flavored. Imagine trying to chew through a slab of smoked eel or mutton, dense with acrid smoke, with little else to soften the flavor. For peasants, this was a gift, allowing them to store food for winter. For us, it would feel like a punishment after just a few bites. Pickling was also common, especially for vegetables. Vinegar, brine, or fermented solutions preserved turnips, cucumbers, and cabbage, creating sharp, sour foods that could last through the lean months. Medieval sauerkraut, for example, was a survival food long before it became a delicacy. But the flavor was harsh, and a lack of balance could make these pickled foods overwhelming. To a modern eater, used to having pickles as a side or accent, the idea of eating large portions of sour, vinegary cabbage as a main food would quickly wear thin. Yet for peasants in winter, it was life itself. Drying was another widespread method, especially for grains, beans, and fruits. Apples and plums could be dried and stored for later, though the results were tough and leathery, not the soft, sweet dried fruits we enjoy today. Dried beans and peas were staples, lasting through the year and providing vital protein. For us, the constant reliance on dried legumes would feel monotonous, though it kept medieval people alive during times of scarcity. Even bread was sometimes dried and stored as hard biscuits, which could last for months if kept dry. These were not the crisp crackers of today, but rock-hard rations that had to be soaked in broth before eating. The quality of preserved food varied widely, and spoilage was always a risk. Salted meat might not be fully cured, leading to mold or rot. Pickled vegetables could ferment too strongly, developing unpleasant odors. Dried grains could attract insects or grow mold if stored improperly. Without modern hygiene or airtight containers, medieval storage was precarious, and people often consumed food that we would immediately discard as unsafe. Stomach illnesses were common, though they were accepted as part of life. To eat like this for even a day would likely leave a modern stomach rebelling. For nobles, preservation also played a role, though they often had fresher supplies thanks to hunting, fishing, and better storage. Still, even in noble households, salted fish, smoked meats, and pickled vegetables were common. These foods were often disguised under heavy sauces, flavored with spices, honey, or vinegar to make them more palatable. Again, the goal was not to highlight the natural flavor, but to mask the preservation. Imagine roasted sturgeon served with a sauce of vinegar, ginger, and saffron, not because it paired well, but because the fish had been salted and needed covering. To us, the results might seem heavy-handed and unpleasant, yet to them it was a mark of culinary refinement. Preservation also shaped daily life in profound ways. During summer and harvest, people worked furiously to prepare food for winter. Meat was slaughtered in the autumn, salted or smoked for storage, while vegetables were pickled or dried. Failure to preserve enough meant hunger, or worse, famine. Preservation was survival strategy, community ritual, and economic driver all at once. Salt was sometimes paid as wages. Dried fish became a major trade item across Europe. The very structure of medieval economies revolved around these preservation techniques. Consider how it would feel to eat nothing but preserved food for days. Breakfast might be a piece of dense rye bread with a slice of salted pork. Lunch could be dried peas stewed into pottage, with perhaps a pickle of cabbage. Dinner might include smoked fish, soaked and boiled to soften, served with another slab of coarse bread. For us, the saltiness, heaviness, and repetition would quickly become intolerable. Our bodies would crave freshness, something crisp or light to balance the weight. But in the Middle Ages, this was not a craving, it was an unattainable luxury. Freshness was fleeting, tied to the seasons, while preserved food was the backbone of survival. The risks of preserved foods also extended to health. Excess salt strained kidneys and led to dehydration. Sour pickles could upset the stomach. Spoiled or contaminated preserved foods caused illnesses that spread quickly in communities. Medieval people accepted these risks because the alternative was starvation. We, with our abundance of refrigeration, pasteurization, and safe storage, would struggle not only with the taste, but with the constant threat of sickness. To last even a single day eating preserved medieval foods would test more than your palate. It would test your body's resilience against dangers long forgotten in the modern age. In the end, preservation reveals the constant fragility of medieval life. Every bite carried the taste of necessity, not choice. Salty, smoky, sour, or leathery, preserved foods were reminders of survival in a harsh world. To us, they would feel unpleasant, even unbearable. But for them, they were life itself. Proof that even without the luxuries we take for granted, they found ways to endure. And if you were to step into their world, even for one day, the shock of preservation would make you realize just how much you depend on modern freshness and how difficult it would be to last on medieval food. If the preservation methods of the medieval world left food harsh and difficult, then the absence of sugar as we know it today would be another shock to anyone attempting to live on their diet. Today, sugar is everywhere: soft drinks, candies, desserts, even hidden in sauces and breads. It shapes our cravings, comforts us, and adds balance to bitter or savory dishes. In the Middle Ages, however, sugar was a rare luxury, found only on the tables of the wealthy. For most people, sweetness came not from sugar, but from honey, fruit, or occasionally syrups made from boiled-down juices. To live a single day without the constant background sweetness of modern food would feel like a withdrawal, a reminder of just how dependent we are on sugar in ways we rarely notice. Honey was the most common sweetener, harvested from wild bees or kept in simple hives. It was valuable, not just for flavor, but also for its symbolic and medicinal qualities. Honey was used in sauces, to glaze roasted meats, to sweeten ale or wine, and in simple cakes. But even honey was not abundant for peasants. It required access to bees and the labor of tending hives, and its availability could vary from year to year. Most peasants rarely tasted honey, and when they did, it was in small amounts. For nobles, honey was used more lavishly, but even then, it lacked the intensity of refined sugar. Imagine eating a pie sweetened only with honey, dense, sticky, and far less sweet than what you would expect. The difference would be striking, especially for someone used to modern desserts. Fruit was another source of sweetness, though seasonal and limited. Apples, pears, plums, and cherries were common in some regions, while figs and dates were imported for the wealthy. These fruits were eaten fresh when available, but more often dried or cooked into stews and pies. Raisins were especially popular in noble kitchens, used to sweeten meat dishes or baked goods. Yet for peasants, fruit was seasonal and quickly consumed when ripe, with little preservation available beyond drying. To a modern person, used to year-round access to bananas, berries, or citrus, the sudden scarcity of fruit would be jarring. Months could pass without a single taste of sweetness, replaced instead by the monotony of grains and vegetables. Sugar itself was known in Europe by the Middle Ages, but it was so rare and expensive that it was treated more like a spice than a staple. Imported from the Middle East and later from the Canary Islands and beyond, sugar was sold in small, hard cones that had to be shaved down for use. Only the wealthiest nobles and royals could afford it regularly. It was used sparingly, often in medicine, believed to have healing properties, or in extravagant banquets where sweet dishes were designed to astonish guests. A noble feast might include candied almonds, sugar-dusted pastries, or elaborate sculptures made entirely of sugar. These displays were more about wealth than taste, since the sugar was coarse, sometimes gritty, and very different from the refined crystals we use today. To the poor, sugar was almost mythical, something heard of but rarely, if ever, tasted. The lack of sugar had profound effects on medieval cooking. Flavors leaned heavily on savory, sour, and salty profiles, with sweetness reserved for rare occasions. A sauce might be flavored with honey, vinegar, and spices, creating a strange blend of sweet and sour that feels unbalanced to us. Meat pies might contain raisins or prunes, not to create dessert, but to stretch the flavor and add richness. Ale and wine were sometimes sweetened with honey or herbs, though they remained far less sugary than modern beverages. To us, accustomed to a steady diet of hidden sugars, these flavors would feel austere, even harsh. The body, conditioned to crave sweetness, would quickly feel unsatisfied. For peasants, the absence of sugar meant that life was defined by blandness. Meals of bread, pottage, and vegetables rarely contained any sweet notes. Festivals or special days might bring a small honey cake or a piece of dried fruit, but such treats were rare and deeply cherished. Imagine waiting months for the taste of sweetness, and then savoring a simple honey pastry as though it were the richest dessert in the world. This scarcity gave sweetness a power we cannot easily imagine today. It was not background noise in every meal. It was a rare spark of joy. For nobles, the occasional abundance of sugar created strange extremes. Their cooks experimented with dishes that mingled sweet and savory in ways that might bewilder us. Roast meats glazed with honey and sprinkled with cinnamon, pies combining beef with raisins and cloves, wines thickened with sugar syrup. These combinations reflected both wealth and a very different sense of taste. Sweetness was not isolated into desserts as we do today. It was woven into the main courses, layered into sauces, and used to dazzle the senses. To us, the effect might be cloying, unbalanced, or confusing. Where we expect sugar to complement, they used it to overwhelm. The absence of everyday sugar also shaped health. Medieval people suffered fewer cavities than later generations, partly because their diets were lower in refined sugars. But they also lacked the energy spikes and emotional comfort that sugar provides us. A modern person, attempting to live even one day without hidden sugars, would likely feel the difference in mood and energy. The heaviness of salted meats, the sourness of pickled vegetables, the blandness of bread and pottage all would weigh heavily without the relief of sweetness. It would not just be a culinary absence. It would be an emotional one. Imagine ending a long day of eating medieval food. You have had coarse bread, pottage of beans and cabbage, salted fish, and perhaps a piece of smoked pork. You long for something sweet to balance the heaviness. But there is no chocolate, no candy, no ice cream, no cake. If you are lucky, you might be offered an apple or a slice of honey cake at a festival. The sweetness is faint, fleeting, and far less intense than what you crave. Your body feels unsatisfied, your palate unbalanced. This, more than anything, would make surviving a single day on medieval food feel unbearable for someone used to modern diets. Ultimately, the scarcity of sugar reveals a world where food was not about indulgence, but about necessity. Sweetness was rare, precious, and deeply symbolic, reserved for the few and cherished by the many. To us, it would feel like deprivation, a constant reminder of how much we rely on sugar without even realizing it. To them, it was a glimpse of luxury, a taste of celebration, and a reminder that food was as much about survival as it was about pleasure. To last a day in their world, without the sweetness we take for granted, would not only test your palate, but your patience, making you realize just how deeply sugar shapes your life today. If the absence of sugar defined much of medieval eating, then the overwhelming presence of dairy, or in some cases, the curious absence of it, was another feature that would confuse a modern eater. Today, dairy is carefully processed, pasteurized, refrigerated, and available in countless varieties. We consume milk, cheese, yogurt, butter, and cream with confidence, rarely worrying whether it will make us ill. In the Middle Ages, however, dairy was a far more precarious part of the diet. It was both a necessity and a risk, shaped by season, preservation limits, and cultural perceptions that varied across class lines. For peasants, dairy was essential. Cows, goats, and sheep provided milk, but because fresh milk spoiled quickly without refrigeration, it was rarely drunk plain. Instead, it was transformed almost immediately into butter, cheese, or curds, which could last longer and provide concentrated nutrition. Peasants relied heavily on these products, since they offered fat, protein, and calories that were often missing from their bread and vegetable diets. A simple meal of bread with cheese or butter might sustain a laborer through long hours in the field. For children, milk and cheese were vital sources of growth, even if the taste and quality varied widely. Imagine drinking milk that was not chilled, sometimes slightly sour by the time it reached your lips, and you begin to understand the difference. To medieval people, this was normal. To us, used to crisp cold milk in a glass, it would feel unsettling and perhaps unsafe. Cheese was by far the most common and practical form of dairy. It could be made fresh, eaten within days, or aged into harder wheels that lasted weeks or months. Each region developed its own types, though nothing like the refined varieties we know today. Medieval cheese was often coarse, salty, and pungent, made more for preservation than delicacy. Peasants ate simple, soft cheeses, while nobles enjoyed richer versions, sometimes flavored with herbs or spices. Hard cheeses were essential for travel, armies, and winter storage, as they could survive long journeys without spoiling. Still, to a modern eater, used to creamy textures and carefully balanced flavors, these cheeses would feel harsh, sometimes too salty or sour to be enjoyable. The smell alone might deter you, yet for medieval families, cheese was life. Butter, too, was central, though its availability depended on region and climate. In northern Europe, where cattle thrived, butter was more common. It was used for cooking, spreading on bread, or as a base for sauces. In southern Europe, where olive oil was more abundant, butter was less central. Butter was highly perishable in warm weather, often turning rancid quickly. Without refrigeration, even nobles faced the challenge of keeping it fresh. Imagine spreading butter on your bread that carried a faint sourness, a reminder that it was on the edge of spoilage. To us, it would be off-putting. To them, it was part of daily reality. Milk also carried social and cultural meanings. Nobles sometimes avoided it, considering it a peasant food, unrefined and too earthy for their status. Instead, they consumed cream, richer and more luxurious, often used in sauces or desserts. Physicians, following the theory of humors, sometimes warned against milk, claiming it created excess phlegm in the body and made people sluggish. Yet for the poor, these warnings meant little. Milk, butter, and cheese were necessary for survival. Once again, class determined not only access to food, but how it was perceived, with the same cow's milk considered humble for one person and refined cream for another. The dangers of dairy in the Middle Ages would be one of the hardest adjustments for us. Without pasteurization, milk could carry bacteria, leading to illness. Spoilage was frequent, and sour milk, curdled or clotted, was often consumed anyway. In fact, sour milk was intentionally used to create dishes like curds and whey, or to be mixed into porridge. Yogurt-like products existed, though less common, and were considered both medicinal and nourishing. To us, the sourness might be tolerable in small doses, but the constant risk of contamination would be alarming. For them, it was simply part of the gamble of eating. Dairy was also closely tied to the rhythm of the seasons. Cows produced more milk in spring and summer, when grass was abundant, but far less in winter. This meant that milk-rich diets fluctuated, and preservation through cheese-making became even more important. During winter, a peasant's diet might rely heavily on stored cheeses, while butter became scarce or rancid. The cycles of abundance and scarcity shaped not just nutrition but daily habits, with families planning their meals around the ebb and flow of dairy. To us, used to constant access to milk year-round, this seasonal rhythm would feel restrictive. The taste of medieval dairy would also challenge us. Fresh milk, when available, was often consumed warm from the animal, with a grassy, earthy flavor that many today would find strange. Butter could be tangy, with hints of fermentation. Cheese might be crumbly, sharp, and intense, lacking the refinement of modern cheddar or brie. Even cream, considered luxurious, was far less smooth and sweet than what we expect. Each product carried the rawness of its origin, unfiltered and unstandardized. For medieval people, this rawness was part of life. For us, it would be a constant reminder of how far removed we are from the farm and how sanitized our foods have become. Dairy also carried symbolic and cultural weight. In religious contexts, butter and cheese were sometimes prohibited during fasting periods, forcing people to adapt their diets. Festivals might feature butter-rich dishes as a celebration, especially before Lent. In some regions, butter became a symbol of wealth and was even used as rent or payment. Cheese, too, became a form of trade, with monasteries specializing in production and selling wheels to sustain their communities. The presence or absence of dairy was not just about food, it was about culture, economy, and faith. Imagine yourself at a medieval table once again. Breakfast might be a slice of dark bread with a smear of butter, faintly sour from storage. Lunch could be bread with a lump of cheese, sharp and salty, paired with a cup of small ale. Dinner might include curds stirred into pottage, adding thickness and a tangy flavor. At first, it might seem manageable, even comforting. But after hours of heaviness, saltiness, and sourness, your body would crave the creamy smoothness of modern dairy products. You might long for a glass of cold milk, a spoonful of yogurt, or a slice of mild cheese. Instead, you would have to accept the roughness, the sour edges, and the constant risk of spoilage that defined their dairy world. In the end, dairy in the Middle Ages reflects the ingenuity and limitations of their lives. It was nourishment, medicine, trade, and culture, all in one. Yet it was also precarious, shaped by spoilage, season, and class. To us, it would feel unrefined, risky, and at times unpalatable. To them, it was survival. To last a day on medieval dairy, you would have to set aside expectations of freshness, safety, and balance, embracing instead a world where every bite was uncertain, and where the taste of milk or cheese carried with it both life and danger. One of the most defining features of medieval eating was not just what people consumed, but how deeply religion shaped when and how they ate it. Food in the Middle Ages was never just about hunger. It was about morality, obedience, and spiritual discipline. For modern people, accustomed to eating whatever they want at any time of day, the restrictions imposed by the church would feel severe. Entire weeks, even months, were structured around fasting, abstinence, and specific dietary rules. If you were to step into this world, you would not only struggle with the food itself, but with the relentless rhythm of religious control over your meals. The Christian church dictated much of daily life, and diet was no exception. One of the most significant rules was the prohibition against eating meat on Fridays and during Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter. In fact, depending on the region and interpretation, nearly half the days of the calendar were marked by some form of fasting or abstinence. On these days, meat from warm-blooded animals was forbidden, forcing people to rely on fish, eggs, dairy, vegetables, and grains. For the wealthy, who indulged in rich meats daily, this was a significant shift. For peasants, who rarely had access to meat anyway, fasting days looked much like every other day: bread, pottage, and maybe a bit of fish if it could be had. But fasting did not always mean eating nothing. Instead, it often meant reducing meals, abstaining from luxury, or changing ingredients. A noble might still enjoy an elaborate feast on a fasting day, filled with fish dishes flavored with saffron, almonds, and raisins, all within the rules. A peasant, by contrast, would continue eating the same humble fare, perhaps with fewer additions than usual. The contrast was stark, and it highlighted the way fasting could be more symbolic than truly sacrificial for the upper classes. To a modern eater, the idea of being forced into such dietary patterns by religious authority would feel intrusive and frustrating. Imagine being told that every Friday you must avoid meat, or that for 6 weeks every spring your meals would be restricted not by choice, but by obligation. Fish became central to these fasting traditions, and as a result, it was elevated far beyond its natural abundance. Oceans, rivers, and ponds were heavily fished, and monasteries often kept their own fish ponds to ensure a steady supply. Salted herring, smoked eel, and dried cod traveled across Europe in vast quantities to feed the demand. Even in inland regions, preserved fish was expected to appear on fasting tables. This heavy reliance on fish created monotony, especially for peasants, who had little variety to begin with. For us, it would feel oppressive to be forced to eat tough, salty fish day after day, simply because the calendar demanded it. The rules extended further than meat versus fish. On strict fasting days, dairy products were also forbidden. Butter, cheese, and eggs had to be set aside, leaving people with even fewer options. To adapt, cooks developed creative substitutes. Almond milk became especially popular, used in sauces, porridges, and even as a substitute for dairy in baking. Nobles, with access to expensive almonds, could maintain rich and flavorful dishes even during fasting. Peasants, however, had no such luxury. For them, fasting days meant pottage thinned with water instead of milk, or bread eaten plain without butter. To a modern person, who might enjoy vegetarian or vegan meals as a matter of choice, the forced absence of dairy and eggs would still feel restrictive, especially when combined with the already limited medieval diet. Religious fasting also carried a sense of morality that we might find strange today. It was not simply about eating less, but about disciplining the body and soul. To overeat, even on plain foods, was considered gluttony, a deadly sin. Meals were supposed to reflect moderation, humility, and piety. Imagine sitting down to eat while being constantly reminded that too much bread, too much cheese, or too much wine could mark you as sinful. The pressure to control not just what you ate, but how much, would weigh heavily on a modern person used to abundance. Food was never simply neutral, it was tied to salvation. For monasteries, food rules were even stricter. Monks followed detailed dietary regulations, often eating only once or twice a day, with meals taken in silence. Their diets were plain, centered on bread, vegetables, beans, and fish. Meat was often forbidden entirely, though exceptions were made for the sick. Meals were seen not as pleasure, but as necessity, a chance to sustain the body while focusing on prayer. To live even one day under such rules would feel ascetic and severe to us, stripping food of its comfort and joy. Yet for monks, this was the path to holiness, and the discipline of the table was as important as the discipline of the mind. The role of feast days also shaped medieval eating. While fasting imposed restriction, feasts exploded with indulgence. Religious festivals were marked by banquets, where nobles displayed wealth with roasted meats, sweetened wines, and elaborate dishes. Even peasants might enjoy extra food during festivals, with communities coming together to share roasted animals, fresh bread, and cakes. These feast days punctuated the calendar, offering moments of abundance amidst scarcity. To a modern person, the rhythm of restriction followed by indulgence might feel extreme days of plain, meager food suddenly replaced by overwhelming banquets heavy with meat and spice. The body would struggle to adapt to such swings, especially without the balance we rely on today. Religious food rules also influenced medicine and perception. Physicians believed that fasting cleansed the body as well as the soul, preventing disease by purging excess humors. Spices and herbs were often prescribed to balance the effects of restricted diets, while certain foods were recommended or avoided based on the liturgical season. To us, these medical ideas seem unscientific, but for medieval people, they shaped not only what they ate, but how they understood health itself. Eating the wrong thing on the wrong day was not just disobedience. It was believed to harm both body and soul. Imagine yourself living under these rules. It is Lent, and for 40 days you cannot eat meat, dairy, or eggs. Breakfast is a slice of coarse bread with perhaps a bit of onion. Lunch is pottage made thin with water and barley, flavored only with a few herbs. Dinner is salted fish, tough and briny, served with cabbage. Day after day, the monotony grinds you down, your body craving variety and richness. Then Easter arrives, and suddenly the tables overflow with roasted lamb, honey cakes, and spiced wine. The indulgence is dizzying, almost overwhelming after weeks of deprivation. Your stomach struggles to handle the shift, and you are reminded that food was not just about hunger in this world. It was about ritual, rhythm, and control. For us, the idea of religious fasting imposed on society as a whole would feel unimaginable. Today, fasting is a personal choice, tied to health, culture, or private devotion. In the Middle Ages, it was mandatory, enforced by the Church, and interwoven with every aspect of life. It created a cycle of scarcity and indulgence, shaping not only the calendar, but the very experience of eating. To live even one day under these rules would feel strange, restrictive, and exhausting. And yet, for medieval people, it was as natural as breathing. Their tables reflected their faith, their obedience, and their constant awareness that food was never just food. It was a test of the soul. Ultimately, the religious rules of medieval eating highlight the greatest difference between their world and ours. We see food as a source of pleasure, comfort, and identity. They saw it as a tool of survival and a measure of piety. To last a single day in this world would not just mean adapting to strange flavors or preservation methods. It would mean surrendering your freedom to the calendar of faith, eating what you were told when you were told, and how much you were told. For us, this loss of choice might be the hardest part of all, a reminder that in the medieval world, every bite was a matter not just of the stomach, but of the soul. If the rhythms of fasting and feasting shaped the medieval calendar, then the great banquets of the nobility were its theatrical highlights. To step into a medieval banquet hall would be to enter a world of spectacle, hierarchy, and extravagance unlike anything we experience today. For a modern person, the sheer abundance of food, the strange flavor combinations, and the lack of hygiene or refinement would be both fascinating and overwhelming. These meals were not simply about eating. They were about power, display, and ritual. And to sit at such a table for even a single evening would test not only your stomach, but also your patience and endurance. Banquets were stages where lords and kings demonstrated wealth and authority. The hall itself set the tone, long wooden tables lined with trenchers of bread, flickering torches casting shadows on the walls, and tapestries draped to impress guests with scenes of conquest or piety. Musicians played, jesters entertained, and servants scurried back and forth carrying heavy platters. To eat here was to participate in a performance, where every dish was a statement. The food itself was less about satisfying hunger and more about awe. A roasted peacock served with its feathers reattached, a boar's head with gilded tusks, a pie that released live birds when cut open all, were designed to astonish. For us, these displays might seem wasteful or even grotesque. For them, they were symbols of status, proof that the host commanded resources and labor beyond imagination. The sequence of dishes followed strict order. Banquets often began with lighter foods, such as fruits or spiced wines, then moved into roasted meats, fish, pies, and stews, before ending with sweetened pastries and exotic confections. Dozens, even hundreds, of dishes could be served, though not everyone tasted everything. The nobility at the high table received the finest and freshest, while those further down the hall received simpler or leftover fare. The arrangement of the tables reinforced hierarchy, reminding everyone of their place in the social order. To us, the inequality might feel offensive. To them, it was simply the way of the world. The flavors of these banquets would bewilder modern palates. As described earlier, heavy use of spices dominated noble cuisine, but banquets took this to extremes. Dishes mixed sweet and savory in ways we would find confusing. Fish baked with raisins and sugar, meat stewed with cinnamon and cloves, or pastries filled with both fruit and minced pork. Almond milk was used liberally to create thick sauces, often colored with saffron or parsley juice to create dramatic hues of gold or green. Food was as much a visual display as a taste experience, and color mattered just as much as flavor. Imagine eating a dish of bright green chicken stew, flavored with herbs and tinted for effect. To medieval diners, this was clever. To us, it might feel unsettling. The sheer heaviness of banquet food would also be a challenge. Roasted meats were plentiful, often dripping with fat. Fish appeared in abundance, salted, smoked, or dressed in elaborate sauces. Pastries were dense and filling, stuffed with mixtures of meat, fruit, and spices. Wine and ale flowed freely, with cups constantly refilled by attentive servants. For a modern person, unused to such richness and volume, the meal would quickly become overwhelming. Indigestion, discomfort, and fatigue would set in long before the banquet ended. And yet, nobles often sat for hours, sometimes even days, through feasts designed to test endurance as much as appetite. Hygiene at banquets would shock us as well. Forks were rarely used, and diners often ate with their fingers, tearing meat from bones and sopping up sauces with bread trenchers. Knives were shared, cups passed between guests, and hands wiped on tablecloths or sleeves. The noise was constant laughter, shouting, music, dogs barking at scraps, and servants bustling. Bones and waste were thrown to the floor, where dogs or servants collected them. To us, the lack of cleanliness would feel off-putting. To them, it was normal, even lively, a sign of abundance and community. Banquets were also opportunities for political maneuvering. Guests were seated according to rank, with proximity to the lord signaling favor or importance. To be invited to a feast was an honor. To be placed near the high table was a privilege. Refusing food or drink could be interpreted as an insult, while partaking showed loyalty and respect. The meal was not just a social event. It was a political stage where alliances were made and rivalries revealed. For us, used to dining as relaxation or pleasure, the constant awareness of status would feel exhausting. Every bite, every gesture carried meaning beyond the plate. For peasants, the experience of a banquet was almost unimaginable. Their daily meals of bread and pottage bore no resemblance to the opulence of noble feasts. Occasionally, They might benefit from leftovers distributed as charity, or they might glimpse the grandeur when serving as kitchen staff or musicians. But to sit at the table was beyond reach. This divide reinforced the gulf between classes, where food itself became a marker of privilege. For us, this inequality would feel stark and unjust. For them, it was simply proof of divine order, with God placing each person in their rightful place. The entertainment at banquets also contributed to the surreal atmosphere. Musicians played lutes, harps, and flutes, while minstrels recited tales of heroes and saints. Jesters performed tricks, acrobats amazed, and sometimes even animals were brought in for spectacle. The food itself often became part of the entertainment. A pie that released live birds was immortalized in rhyme. 24 blackbirds baked in a pie. Such dishes were not meant to be eaten in their entirety, but to amuse and astonish. To us, this blending of food and performance might feel absurd. To them, it was part of the wonder of the feast. Alcohol flowed freely, often leading to drunkenness. Ale and wine were consumed in vast quantities, with toasts and songs punctuating the courses. Drunken brawls, while frowned upon, were not uncommon. To a modern guest, the pressure to drink continuously, combined with the heaviness of the food, would quickly lead to discomfort or illness. Yet for nobles, excess was expected, a demonstration of strength and endurance. Moderation was rarely praised in these settings. To survive a single evening might mean forcing yourself through plate after plate, cup after cup, long past the point of enjoyment. Imagine yourself seated at a medieval banquet. Before you lies a trencher, piled high with roasted meats, dripping with fat, surrounded by pies filled with raisins and pork, fish covered in almond sauce, and bread dyed golden with saffron. A servant fills your cup with sweetened wine, thick and spiced. Music fills the hall, laughter roars, and the air is heavy with smoke, sweat, and the smell of roasting. You take a bite of meat, heavily spiced, strange in flavor, then a pastry dense, sweet, and savory all at once. Soon your stomach feels heavy, the richness cloying. Yet more dishes arrive, each stranger and heavier than the last. Hours pass, and the feast continues. Your body begs for rest, for something light and simple, but the performance demands endurance. You realize that to last even one night at such a table is to endure a kind of culinary trial. In the end, banquets reveal the extremes of medieval dining. They were not about comfort or balance, but about power, spectacle, and abundance. For us, they would feel chaotic, overwhelming, and unhealthy. For them, they were the pinnacle of culture, proof of wealth and prestige. To last a single day eating like a noble at a banquet would be a test of stomach, patience, and spirit. And while the spectacle might amaze, the food itself would likely leave you longing for the simplicity of modern meals, where flavor, balance, and hygiene are taken for granted. The banquet, in all its glory, was both wonder and ordeal and experience that shows just how far removed medieval dining was from our own. While noble banquets dazzled with their excess, the day-to-day life of peasants revealed the opposite extreme. A world where meals were not about spectacle or abundance, but about scraping together enough to survive. For most of the medieval population, food was not a guarantee. Famine, poor harvests, and unstable weather could turn a household's diet from monotonous to desperate overnight. If a noble's feast was a theatrical performance of wealth, a peasant's meal was an exercise in endurance. To step into their shoes for even a single day would confront you with the raw edge of survival, where every bite was shaped by scarcity, labor, and luck. Peasant diets centered almost entirely on bread and pottage. A typical breakfast might be nothing more than a chunk of coarse rye bread dipped into ale. Lunch, taken in the fields during a break from labor, could be bread again, perhaps with an onion or a piece of cheese if the family had access to cows or goats. Dinner, eaten at the end of a long day, was usually pottage, made with grains, beans, and whatever vegetables were available. The pottage pot might simmer constantly at the hearth, with ingredients added over time, creating a never-ending stew that fed the family day after day. It was filling enough to keep people alive, but rarely nourishing in the way we think of balanced diets today. Imagine eating the same stew for weeks, each bowl tasting of cabbage, leeks, and barley, with only slight variation. For us, accustomed to variety and freshness, the monotony would quickly become unbearable. Protein was scarce. Meat was a rare luxury, often only consumed during festivals, weddings, or after a successful hunt, though peasants were usually forbidden to hunt game in the lord's forests. Instead, they might eat scraps of pork from domesticated pigs, small birds they managed to trap, or offal left over from the animals slaughtered for their masters. Eggs provided occasional relief, but hens did not lay consistently year-round, and families often sold eggs at market and then eat them. Fish was another source of protein, though access depended on geography. In coastal areas or near rivers, peasants might catch eels, herring, or freshwater fish, but inland communities often had to rely on salted or dried varieties, which were expensive and unpleasant. For most, beans and peas were the main protein, cheap but repetitive. A modern eater might crave variety after just one day, but medieval peasants had no choice. Vegetables were common, but limited by season. Cabbage, onions, leeks, and turnips filled the pottage pot, while wild greens like nettles or dandelion leaves supplemented diets in the spring. Carrots and parsnips appeared in some regions, though not the bright orange carrots we know today. Those were developed much later. Preservation was minimal, so winter diets were grim: salted cabbage, dried legumes, and hard bread. Fruit was rare, except in harvest seasons, when apples, pears, or berries could be eaten fresh. Dried fruits like raisins or figs were imported and prohibitively expensive, far beyond a peasant's reach. To live even one day on such a restricted seasonal diet would remind us how dependent we are on modern transportation, refrigeration, and supermarkets, where strawberries in winter or bananas year-round are considered ordinary. Famine was a constant threat. Crop failures due to drought, floods, or cold could devastate entire regions. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, left millions starving, forcing desperate measures. Contemporary accounts describe people eating cats, dogs, rats, and even tree bark or clay to stave off hunger. For us, imagining such desperation is difficult, but for medieval peasants, it was reality. Malnutrition was common even in good years, with deficiencies leading to weakened immune systems, stunted growth, and vulnerability to disease. The body simply did not receive the variety of vitamins and minerals it needed, and lives were often short as a result. To try to live even one day in their world, with constant hunger gnawing at you, would feel impossible. Alcohol was another staple, even for peasants. Small ale, weak and low in alcohol, was consumed daily because it was safer than water. Children drank it, and adults relied on it for hydration. The taste was yeasty, cloudy, and sour compared to modern beer, but it was essential. Ale provided calories as well as fluids, making it a kind of liquid bread. Without it, many peasants could not have survived. For us, however, replacing water with ale for a full day would be difficult. The heaviness and constant sourness would grow tiresome, and the body might struggle with the sudden influx of fermented drink. Meals were taken communally, often around a shared pot or loaf. Each family member might have a wooden bowl or simply dip directly into the pot with a spoon. Bread was broken and passed around, with trenchers sometimes doubling as both plate and utensil. Meat, when available, was divided carefully, often with the father or lord of the household receiving the largest portion. To us, used to individual plates, portions, and utensils, the communal style might feel unsanitary or uncomfortable. But for medieval peasants, It was the only practical way to eat. Food was shared, and survival depended on cooperation. The labor required to secure food would also surprise us. There was no quick trip to a store, no packaged meals ready to heat. Every step required effort. Grain had to be grown, harvested, threshed, ground at a mill, kneaded, and baked into bread. Vegetables were planted, tended, and harvested by hand. Livestock required care, and slaughtering animals was messy, laborious work. Even gathering water involved hauling heavy buckets from a well or stream. A single day of eating, like a medieval peasant, meant hours of physical labor just to prepare the basics. For us, used to convenience, this workload would feel overwhelming. The emotional weight of scarcity also shaped meals. Food was never guaranteed, and the anxiety of hunger hung over daily life. Families rationed carefully, saving for winter, planning for lean months, and stretching meals with fillers like oats, beans, or even sawdust or acorns when grain ran short. Imagine the constant worry of whether your children would have enough to eat or whether next year's harvest would fail. Food was not just sustenance, it was survival strategy, community burden, and a source of constant stress. To live under that pressure for even a day would be a test not just of the body, but of the mind. Despite all this hardship, meals could still carry moments of joy. Festivals, weddings, and church holidays brought rare opportunities for abundance. A village feast might include roasted animals, fresh bread, and ale, shared among neighbors in celebration. These occasions offered relief from monotony and hunger, a chance to eat until full. But they were rare, and the memory of them often had to sustain people through long months of plain fare. For us, accustomed to daily indulgence, the contrast would be staggering. The rarity of abundance would make each feast a moment of wonder, but the return to scarcity would be crushing. Imagine yourself living as a medieval peasant for one day. Morning begins with a crust of dark, dense bread dipped in sour ale. You work long hours in the fields, your stomach growling, until midday brings more bread and perhaps an onion to chew on. By evening, you sit with your family around the hearth, dipping spoons into a pot of pottage, thick with cabbage and beans. The flavor is earthy, monotonous, and heavy, but it fills your belly. You drink more ale to quench your thirst. The day ends not with dessert or indulgence, but with hunger still lingering, your body craving variety, freshness, and sweetness. For you, it feels like deprivation. For them, it was normal life. In the end, the peasant's diet reveals the stark reality of medieval survival. It was simple, monotonous, and often inadequate, yet it kept millions alive through hard labor and harsher conditions. To us, it would feel unbearable, a constant reminder of scarcity and effort. To them, it was simply the world they knew. To last a single day as a medieval peasant would be to understand hunger not as a passing inconvenience, but as a daily companion. It would leave you grateful for the abundance and variety of modern food, and humbled by the endurance of those who survived on so little. If the peasants' tables reflected scarcity and nobles' banquets reflected excess, then the monasteries of medieval Europe offered yet another vision of how food shaped life. For monks and nuns, meals were not simply about survival or status. They were about devotion, discipline, and the shaping of the soul. Monastic diets were heavily influenced by religious rules, with strict schedules, limited choices, and spiritual symbolism woven into every bite. To us, used to eating freely whenever hunger strikes, the rigid routine and austerity of monastery dining would feel confining. Yet for medieval monastics, food was central to their way of life, a means of channeling physical needs into spiritual practice. Monastic communities followed rules set out by their orders, the most influential being the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, but shaping monasteries for centuries afterward. This rule emphasized moderation and discipline. Monks were to eat simply, avoiding indulgence, and meals were to be taken in silence, accompanied only by readings from Scripture. Gluttony was considered a sin, and the table was a place to practice restraint. A Benedictine monk might be allowed 2 cooked dishes per day, with some bread and fruit, but meat from 4-legged animals was generally forbidden. Fish, eggs, and dairy were permitted in some contexts, but even these could be restricted during fasting periods. Imagine sitting in a cold stone refectory, eating a bowl of vegetable stew while a fellow monk read from the Bible. The silence would weigh heavily, turning the act of eating into a meditation rather than a pleasure. Meals were scheduled at specific times, usually 2 per day, 1 at midday and 1 in the evening. Breakfast as we know it was rare, though a small piece of bread might be allowed before labor in some orders. The timing of meals followed the monastic hours of prayer, meaning that eating was integrated into the spiritual rhythm of the day. For us, used to eating on impulse or according to work schedules, this rigid structure would feel alien. Hunger might gnaw during long hours of prayer or labor, but monks were expected to endure patiently, seeing their discomfort as a form of discipline. The food itself was plain. Bread, pottage, vegetables, and legumes formed the base of the monastic diet. Fish appeared often, especially on fasting days when meat was prohibited. Cheese and eggs supplemented meals, providing protein and fat, but rarely in abundance. Wine or ale was consumed, but usually in small quantities, carefully measured to avoid excess. The portions were modest enough to sustain, but never to satisfy indulgence. For us, accustomed to eating until full, the constant moderation would feel frustrating. Yet for monks, this was the point: to restrain desire, to tame the body, and to focus on higher things. Some monasteries, especially wealthy ones, did enjoy better food. Monastic estates often included gardens, orchards, vineyards, and fish ponds, allowing communities to produce much of their own sustenance. Skilled monks became excellent brewers and vintners, and many monasteries gained reputations for their beer, wine, and cheese traditions that continue today. Yet even when food was plentiful, the rules of moderation applied. A monk could not indulge in excess without violating the vows of discipline. To us, it might seem paradoxical, living amid abundance yet bound by austerity. To them, it was a reminder that the purpose of food was not pleasure but nourishment. Silence at meals would be another striking difference. In most monasteries, meals were taken without conversation. A reader recited from sacred texts while the monks ate, heads bowed, chewing quietly. This silence was meant to prevent idle chatter and keep the mind focused on God. Imagine sitting among dozens of others, a hall echoing only with the sounds of spoons scraping bowls and pages turning. To us, meals are often social, times to talk, laugh, and share stories. To medieval monks, they were solemn, a continuation of prayer. For a modern person, the lack of conversation would make meals feel lonely, even oppressive, though to monks it was discipline. Fasting played a major role in monastic life. During Lent and other holy seasons, diets became even more restricted, with meat, dairy, and sometimes even eggs removed. Meals shrank in size, and hunger became a constant companion. This was not accidental, it was a deliberate spiritual practice. To feel hunger was to remember dependence on God. For us, such restriction would feel harsh, even unhealthy. For monks, it was sanctifying. The body was seen as something to discipline, not to indulge, and food was the battleground. The labor of producing food also shaped monastic diets. Monks farmed fields, tended orchards, brewed ale, and raised fish. Their meals came directly from their labor, creating a close connection between work and sustenance. The act of farming was itself a form of prayer, and eating the fruits of that labor reinforced the cycle of devotion. For us, distanced from the sources of our food, this connection might feel humbling. To eat bread baked from grain you harvested, threshed, and milled is to understand food in a deeper way. Yet the sheer physical effort required would also be exhausting. The role of monasteries in broader society also cannot be ignored. Many monasteries provided alms to the poor, offering bread, pottage, or ale to those in need. Their kitchens became centers of charity, feeding not just monks, but the surrounding community. Monastic hospitality was legendary, with travelers and pilgrims receiving food and lodging. Yet even in hospitality, the food was plain and disciplined. Guests might be surprised by the austerity, expecting feasts from wealthy institutions, only to find bowls of beans and loaves of coarse bread. For us, used to associating hospitality with abundance, the simplicity might feel disappointing. For medieval people, it was an act of service. Monastic food also carried symbolic meaning. Bread was the body of Christ, wine his blood, and the daily act of eating and drinking reinforced spiritual truths. Meals were not just physical events, but extensions of liturgy. The Eucharist was central, and the act of eating bread and drinking wine in ordinary meals echoed this sacred ritual. To us, food is often secular, stripped of spiritual meaning. For monks, every bite was layered with symbolism. Living even a day under this mindset would feel profoundly different, turning the simplest meal into a religious act. Imagine yourself as a monk for a single day. You rise before dawn, praying through cold, dim hours before breakfast is allowed. Hunger gnaws at your stomach, but discipline requires silence. At midday, you sit in the refectory with your brothers. Before you is a bowl of pottage with beans and cabbage, a slice of coarse bread, and a small piece of cheese. You eat quietly as scripture is read, each bite filling but plain. In the evening, another simple meal awaits, perhaps fish stewed with leeks and herbs. You drink a small cup of ale, measured carefully to prevent excess. The day ends, and though you have eaten enough to survive, you never feel indulgently full. Your body feels restrained, your mind directed toward prayer. For us, this would feel like deprivation. For monks, it was discipline, a way to remind themselves daily that food was not the goal faith was. In the end, the monastic diet reveals the spiritual dimension of medieval eating. While peasants ate to survive and nobles ate to display wealth, monks ate to train the soul. Their meals were plain, repetitive, and modest, designed not for pleasure, but for discipline. To us, they would feel austere, joyless, even punishing. But to monks, they were sacred, a means of aligning body and spirit. To last a single day under such a regime would challenge not only your stomach, but your very idea of what food means. It would strip away indulgence, comfort, and sociality, leaving only the bare essentials: bread, pottage, silence, and prayer. For us, that might feel unbearable. For them, it was the path to holiness. If monasteries show how food could become a tool of discipline and devotion, then the bustling markets of medieval towns reveal another side of the story, how food connected people to trade, money, and the wider world. For peasants who lived in villages, food was mostly grown or produced at home. But in towns and cities, or even during weekly market days in rural regions, the marketplace was where people encountered variety, choice, and the possibility, though not the guarantee, of something different from their daily bread and pottage. To us modern shoppers, who wander supermarkets filled with dazzling abundance, a medieval market would seem shockingly limited, chaotic, and unsanitary. Yet for medieval people, it was the center of economic and social life, the place where survival and community intersected. Markets were held weekly or seasonally, often in the open air of a town square or alongside a church. Stalls were set up with produce, grains, dairy, fish, and occasional luxuries. The smells would overwhelm modern senses. The pungent odor of salted fish stacked in barrels, the sharp tang of vinegar from pickled vegetables, the sweetness of honeycombs, the earthy scent of live chickens, and the ever-present background of unwashed bodies. There was no refrigeration, no packaging, and no hygiene standards. Flies buzzed around meat hung in the open, Dogs scavenged scraps, and waste ran through the streets. To us, the lack of cleanliness would be alarming. To them, it was simply the reality of commerce. For peasants, markets were both opportunity and temptation. Selling surplus produce, eggs, or dairy provided money for goods they could not make themselves: salt, iron tools, cloth, or, on rare occasions, spices. But buying food at market was expensive. Bread was usually baked at home, but towns had bakers selling loaves of different sizes and qualities. Meat could be purchased, though often in small quantities, scraps, offal, or salted cuts rather than prime roasts. Fishmongers sold herring, eels, or dried cod, preserved in ways that made them affordable but unappetizing to modern palates. Vegetables were available, but usually the same staples peasants grew themselves: onions, leeks, cabbages. Fruit appeared seasonally, and the sight of apples, pears, or plums might excite children who rarely enjoyed sweetness. To live on market purchases for even one day would strain a peasant's budget and offer little improvement in variety. Nobles and wealthy townsfolk approached markets differently. They had money to spend on luxuries: imported figs, almonds, saffron, pepper, and sugar, all sold at astonishing prices. These items traveled through long trade routes from Asia and the Middle East, passed from merchant to merchant, until they reached European towns. To place saffron in your pottage or sprinkle pepper on your meat was not just a matter of taste, but a display of wealth. Imagine paying the equivalent of several days' wages for a handful of peppercorns. To us, it would seem absurd. To them, it was prestige. A noble might leave the market with baskets of exotic goods, while a peasant might leave with nothing more than a bit of salt and a new iron pot. The chaos of the market added to its character. Hawkers shouted their wares, women haggled over prices, and merchants boasted of their goods. Fraud was common, and authorities sometimes had to regulate weights and measures to prevent cheating. Bread, for instance, was strictly monitored in many towns, with bakers punished for selling loaves underweight. Still, manipulation persisted. Merchants might water down ale, mix cheap grains with wheat flour, or pass off stale fish as fresh. For a modern shopper, used to expiration dates, consumer protections, and standardized weights, the uncertainty would be maddening. Every purchase carried risk, and every buyer had to trust their eyes, nose, and experience. Street food also existed in markets, though far from what we imagine today. Pies filled with meat or fish were sold, often to workers who could not return home for meals. These pies were dense, salty, and heavily spiced to mask questionable freshness. Hot porridge or pottage might be ladled out for a coin, filling but plain. Ale was available everywhere, served from barrels into wooden mugs. For us, the idea of eating street food surrounded by dirt, flies, and waste would be unappealing, but for medieval townsfolk, it was convenient and practical. A worker could grab a meat pie, a mug of ale, and return to labor, stomach filled enough to keep going. Markets also reflected the rhythms of the agricultural year. In autumn, stalls overflowed with fresh apples, nuts, and vegetables, reserved for winter in pickles, drying racks, or cellars. In spring, the fare was leaner, with fewer fresh goods and more reliance on stored grains or legumes. Fairs, larger than weekly markets, offered even more variety, drawing merchants from distant regions. At these events, one might find rare spices, fine wines, and luxurious fabrics, alongside livestock and everyday produce. To us, they would feel like a mix of farmers' market, carnival, and trade expo, but with far more noise, smell, and unpredictability. The sensory overload of a market would likely overwhelm a modern visitor. Imagine walking through narrow lanes crowded with people, animals, and goods. To your left, a butcher chops meat, blood running into the gutter. To your right, a fishmonger shouts about fresh eels wriggling in tubs. Ahead, a baker holds up loaves of dark rye, while a brewer ladles out foaming ale. Children tug at their mothers' skirts, begging for a honey cake. The air is thick with smoke from roasting meat, the stink of waste, and the pungency of onions and garlic. It is both lively and nauseating, a place where survival, commerce, and community collide. Socially, the market was more than just food. It was where people met, shared news, and saw the wider world. For peasants, it was a chance to glimpse goods they could never afford, to marvel at spices or fabrics beyond imagination. For townsfolk, it was a place of gossip, negotiation, and display. For nobles, it was a reminder of their wealth as they purchased luxuries with ease. Food in the market was a reflection of status, just as it was at the table. The rich could buy variety, while the poor endured monotony. For us, the market would feel chaotic, unsanitary, and limited. The absence of refrigeration would mean much of the food smelled strong, looked rough, or was already spoiling. The lack of choice would frustrate anyone used to supermarkets stocked with hundreds of options. Even something simple like finding fresh fruit would depend entirely on season and luck. To try to feed yourself for a day using only a medieval market would result in strange combinations. A hunk of coarse bread, a salted herring, a wedge of sharp cheese, maybe a handful of dried peas. It would fill the stomach, but it would hardly satisfy. And yet, for medieval people, the market was a lifeline, the place where survival connected with community, trade, and the rhythms of life. In the end, the medieval market shows how different our relationship with food has become. We see shopping as convenience. They saw it as risk, opportunity, and necessity. To us, the chaos and lack of cleanliness would be intolerable. To them, it was the beating heart of the town. To last a single day eating only what you could buy at a medieval market would leave you longing for the sterile aisles, neat packaging, and endless choice of the modern supermarket. But for them, it was life, a weekly reminder that food was not just about eating, but about community, trade, and survival. If the market was the heartbeat of towns, then the kitchens, both humble hearths and grand castle cookhouses, were the places where food became real meals. Yet the medieval kitchen looked and felt nothing like what we know today. There were no gas stoves, no ovens with temperature dials, no refrigerators, and no running water. Cooking was done over open fires, in smoky rooms where heat was difficult to control and accidents were common. For a modern person, trying to prepare even a single meal in such a kitchen would be frustrating, dangerous, and exhausting. Yet for medieval people, it was the ordinary rhythm of daily life. In peasant homes, the hearth was the center of everything. Built of stone or clay, it provided warmth, light, and the only means of cooking. A single iron pot often hung over the fire, used for boiling pottage, brewing ale, or heating water. Bread, if baked at home, was cooked on flat stones or in clay ovens shared by the village. Most peasants did not own personal ovens, so communities often brought dough to a communal bakehouse, where a baker managed the heat of a large oven and charged families for space. This meant bread was baked in batches, not daily, and loaves were made to last, often going stale quickly. Imagine baking bread only once a week, eating slices that grew harder with each passing day. To us, accustomed to soft loaves and fresh rolls, it would feel like deprivation. To them, it was necessity. Cooking over the hearth was slow and unpredictable. Fires burned unevenly, flaring or dying, depending on the wood, wind, and weather. Recipes as we know them did not exist. Instead, cooking relied on instinct, experience, and tradition. A peasant woman might stir the pottage pot, tasting and adjusting with whatever herbs or scraps were available. There were no exact measurements, no timers, just judgment passed down through generations. For us, used to precise cooking methods, this would feel chaotic, but for them, it was second nature. In noble households, kitchens were larger and more elaborate, but also far more chaotic. Great castles and manors employed teams of cooks, spit boys, and servants to prepare massive quantities of food for banquets. Huge fireplaces dominated the cookhouses, with spits turning whole animals over roaring flames. Boys rotated the spits for hours, their faces reddened by heat, while cooks basted the meat with sauces thickened from wine, vinegar, or almond milk. Large cauldrons boiled stews, and bakers worked dough into pies filled with meats, fruits, and spices. The air was hot, smoky, and filled with the smell of roasting flesh. For a modern cook, stepping into such a kitchen would feel overwhelming, noisy, dangerous, and oppressive. Tools were simple but effective. Knives, wooden spoons, and ladles were the most common implements. Mortar and pestles ground herbs and spices, while sieves strained sauces. Cauldrons, griddles, and spits formed the backbone of cooking equipment. Pottery, pewter, and wooden bowls held food, though noble kitchens sometimes used more elaborate vessels of silver. Yet everything required muscle. Grinding spices by hand, chopping meat without sharp steel knives, or kneading dense rye dough by candlelight demanded physical effort. Cooking was not a hobby or a pleasure, it was labor. Hygiene in kitchens was far from modern standards. Water had to be hauled in from wells or streams, and waste was often thrown into the street or gutters. Meat was butchered on wooden blocks that absorbed blood and odors. In noble kitchens, servants trampled across floors littered with scraps, bones, and ash. Dogs and cats roamed freely, scavenging leftovers. To us, the lack of sanitation would feel appalling. Yet medieval cooks developed strong stomachs, and diners accepted the risks. Illness from contaminated food was common, but alternatives were few. To cook and eat in such conditions for even one day would be unnerving, constantly reminding us how fragile safety was. The role of the cook was highly respected in noble households. Skilled cooks could transform tough cuts of meat or preserved fish into elaborate dishes with heavy sauces and striking colors. Their ability to balance flavors or to disguise them was valued as much as a knight's prowess in battle. Cookbooks began to appear in the later Middle Ages, filled with instructions for elaborate dishes that blended sweet and savory or used spices in dazzling ways. Yet these books were aimed at nobles, not peasants. The average villager never saw a recipe written down, relying instead on tradition. For us, the gap between simple peasant cooking and elaborate noble cuisine would be stark, reminding us how food reinforced social divisions. Seasonality also shaped kitchens. In summer, fresh vegetables and fruits filled pots and pies. In winter, kitchens relied on preserved foods, salted meat, pickled cabbage, dried beans. The challenge of keeping fires burning, ovens heated, and supplies stretched through the cold months meant constant work. In noble households, kitchens became hubs of storage as well as cooking, with pantries filled with salted fish, barrels of ale, sacks of grain, and baskets of dried fruits. Servants managed these supplies carefully, ensuring that nothing spoiled prematurely. For peasants, storage was simpler cellars dug into the earth, where turnips and cabbages were piled, or sacks of grain hung from rafters to deter rodents. Yet spoilage was inevitable, and the smell of rot in winter kitchens was familiar. To us, accustomed to refrigeration and plastic packaging, the lack of control would be unbearable. Fire was both essential and dangerous. Burns were common, smoke filled lungs, and houses often risked burning down from stray sparks. In noble kitchens, multiple fires roared at once, creating unbearable heat. In peasant cottages, smoke often vented poorly, filling rooms until eyes stung and walls blackened. Children grew up in these smoky environments, their lungs hardened by constant exposure. Imagine trying to cook dinner while choking on smoke, eyes watering, and flames licking dangerously close to your clothes. For us, it would be intolerable. For them, it was daily life. Despite the harshness, kitchens were also places of community. Families gathered around the hearth, sharing warmth and stories as food simmered. In noble kitchens, servants bonded under pressure, working together to prepare massive feasts. Kitchens were noisy, messy, and alive, reflecting the centrality of food in daily existence. For us, kitchens are often clean, organized, and designed for comfort. For them, kitchens were battlegrounds of survival, filled with labor, smoke, and fire. Imagine yourself cooking in a medieval kitchen for one day. Morning begins with hauling water from the well, lighting a fire with damp wood, and stirring yesterday's pottage, now slightly sour, to make it edible again. You grind onions and herbs with a mortar, knead heavy dough for bread, and carry it to the communal bakehouse. The afternoon brings the butchering of a chicken, feathers flying, blood staining the floor. Smoke stings your eyes as you roast it over a fire, basting with vinegar and pepper to hide the gaminess. Dinner is served in wooden bowls, eaten with fingers and knives, washed down with ale. By evening, you are exhausted, your body aching from the labor of cooking. You realize that preparing food in this world is not a pleasure, it is survival, an endless cycle of fire, smoke, and toil. In the end, medieval kitchens reveal the raw labor behind every meal. They were smoky, dangerous, and exhausting, but they kept families and lords alive. To us, they would feel unbearable, reminders of how fragile food safety and comfort once were. To medieval people, they were the heart of the home, or the engine of a castle, the place where hunger met labor. To last a single day cooking in their kitchens would test not only your skill, but your strength, your lungs, and your patience. It would leave you longing for the simple ease of a modern stove, a refrigerator, and the miracle of clean water flowing from a tap. After exploring bread, pottage, meat, fish, vegetables, dairy, markets, and kitchens, one final piece of the medieval dining puzzle remains: the experience of actually sitting down to eat. It is here that the differences between their world and ours come into sharp focus. For medieval people, meals were not simply about flavor or nutrition. They were about hierarchy, ritual, and survival. To us, eating is often casual, individual, and flexible. For them, every meal was shaped by who you were, where you sat, what resources you had, and what rules you obeyed. To live even a single day under their dining customs would be bewildering, uncomfortable, and sometimes even dangerous. The structure of meals varied by class. Peasants typically ate 2 meals a day, one around midday and another in the evening. Breakfast was rare, though some might grab a crust of bread before beginning fieldwork. Meals were short, functional, and centered on the hearth. Families gathered around a pot of pottage or shared bread, each person dipping into the communal dish with wooden spoons or fingers. There were no individual plates or elaborate courses. Food was served in whatever vessels were available: bowls of clay, wood, or horn. The atmosphere was practical rather than social. Meals were a moment to refuel after hours of labor. Imagine sitting down with your family to a single pot of cabbage and barley, everyone dipping from the same bowl, smoke filling the room, dogs begging at your feet. To us, this would feel humble, even unsanitary. To them, it was normal. For nobles, dining was a ritual of status. Meals were taken at specific times, with multiple courses served in sequence. Seating arrangements reinforced hierarchy. The lord and his closest allies sat at the high table, elevated above the others, while lesser guests and servants sat further down. Trenchers of bread served as plates, with sauces and stews poured directly onto them. Forks were rare, and food was eaten with knives, spoons, or bare hands. Napkins were scarce, so hands were wiped on tablecloths or clothing. Dogs roamed freely, snapping up scraps. The noise of conversation, clatter of cups, and smell of roasting meat filled the hall. To us, this lack of cleanliness and order would feel shocking. To them, it was convivial, a sign of abundance and community. Hospitality was a central virtue. Guests were expected to eat heartily, and refusing food could be considered rude or insulting. At noble tables, servants constantly refilled cups of wine or ale, encouraging heavy drinking. Toasts, songs, and jokes punctuated the courses. Eating was both nourishment and entertainment, a social performance as much as a physical act. For us, accustomed to meals as either private family events or quiet social gatherings, the sheer noise and intensity of a medieval feast would be overwhelming. Imagine trying to eat while musicians played loudly, gestures performed, and servants rushed back and forth. It would feel more like a festival than a dinner. Ritual also shaped meals in religious households. In monasteries, as we saw earlier, meals were eaten in silence, accompanied by scripture readings. In contrast, lay households mixed food with song, prayer, and conversation. Grace was said before and after meals, reminding everyone that food was a gift from God. To us, such ritual would feel formal and repetitive. To them, it was a necessary acknowledgement of divine providence. Even a simple crust of bread was not eaten without gratitude. Food sharing reflected both necessity and hierarchy. In peasant homes, meals were communal because resources were scarce. Everyone ate from the same pot to stretch food as far as possible. In noble halls, sharing was symbolic. High-ranking diners received the best cuts, while lower-ranking ones received leftovers or less desirable portions. Servants sometimes ate after the main meal, consuming whatever remained. This constant awareness of rank was embedded into the very act of eating. For us, who prize equality at the table, it would feel stifling to have your status literally measured by what food you received. The pace of meals also differed. Peasant meals where quick laborers had little time to linger, and food was too scarce to waste. Noble meals, by contrast, could stretch for hours. Course after course arrived, interspersed with entertainment, conversation, and ceremony. Banquets could last well into the night, testing the endurance of diners. For us, used to eating within an hour, the endless procession of dishes would feel exhausting. Combined with the richness of noble fare, it would likely lead to discomfort long before the feast ended. Hygiene, or the lack thereof, would be one of the hardest aspects for a modern person to endure. Shared cups passed from hand to hand, hands wiped on tablecloths, bones thrown to the floor, and scraps left for dogs created an atmosphere far from modern cleanliness. Illness spread easily in such environments, with contaminated food or drink infecting many at once. For us, used to sterile utensils, clean plates, and regulated food safety, the medieval table would feel unsanitary and unsafe. To eat for even a single day under such conditions would likely result in stomach trouble or worse. Drinking customs further complicated meals. Ale and wine were consumed constantly, with water rarely trusted. For peasants, small ale was mild enough to drink throughout the day, even by children. For nobles, stronger wine and spiced drinks flowed freely. Intoxication was common, and drunkenness at feasts was not unusual. For us, replacing water with alcohol all day would be disorienting, leading to fatigue or nausea. Yet for them, it was the safest and most reliable liquid available. Festivals and celebrations amplified these customs. Weddings, religious holidays, and harvest festivals turned meals into communal spectacles. Whole animals were roasted, bread baked in abundance, and ale flowed freely. Music, dancing, and games accompanied the food. For peasants, these rare moments of abundance were cherished memories, breaking the monotony of daily scarcity. For nobles, they were opportunities to demonstrate wealth and generosity. To us, such feasts might feel joyous but overwhelming, with excess food, noise, and chaos blurring the line between celebration and indulgence. The psychology of eating in the Middle Ages also differed. For us, food is often tied to pleasure, comfort, and personal choice. For them, it was tied to duty, hierarchy, and survival. A peasant ate what was available, not what they wanted. A noble ate to display wealth, not necessarily to enjoy flavor. A monk ate to discipline the body, not to indulge the senses. To live even one day under these conditions would strip away much of what we take for granted about food, that it should be enjoyable, clean, balanced, and freely chosen. Instead, you would be constantly reminded of your place, your obligations, and your limitations. Imagine yourself sitting at a medieval meal. You reach for a trencher of bread, dark and coarse, its crust tough. A servant ladles pottage into your bowl, steaming with cabbage and onions. A piece of salted fish is placed before you, leathery and briny, softened only by a sour sauce. You lift your cup of ale, cloudy and yeasty, passing it back to your neighbor when you are done. Dogs circle your feet, snatching bones as they fall. Music plays in the background, or perhaps scripture is read in solemn tones. The flavors are heavy, the air smoky, the atmosphere loud or silent, depending on where you are. You eat because you must, not because you enjoy. By the end of the day, your stomach feels heavy, your mouth longs for freshness, and your mind aches for the quiet comfort of modern meals. Ultimately, medieval dining customs highlight how deeply food reflected society. Meals were not just private acts of nourishment, but public displays of hierarchy, ritual, and culture. To us, they would feel alien, dirty, restrictive, and uncomfortable. To them, they were the rhythms of life. To last even a single day eating at a medieval table would challenge more than your stomach. It would test your patience, your tolerance, and your very understanding of what it means to eat together. And so, as we leave behind the smoky kitchens, the endless pottage pots, the salty slabs of fish, and the grand but overwhelming banquets, it becomes clear why you probably wouldn't last a single day eating medieval food. What was normal for them, monotonous bread, heavy stews, risky preservation, strict religious fasting, and chaotic dining customs, would quickly overwhelm us today. Our bodies crave freshness, safety, and variety, while they're adapted to a world where food was survival first and comfort second. For nobles, food was a performance of wealth and power. For peasants, it was a daily battle against hunger. And for monks, it was a discipline of the soul. In every case, food was never just food. It was status, faith, labor, and endurance. If you imagine yourself sitting at one of those tables, whether a peasant's smoky cottage, a noble's noisy hall, or a monk's silent refectory, you realize how different our world has become. Even one day on their diet would feel like a trial of body and spirit. And yet, through all the hardship, these meals sustained millions, shaping centuries of history. Their endurance reminds us of the resilience of human beings, even under conditions we would struggle to tolerate. Thank you for spending this time exploring the strange, challenging, and fascinating world of medieval food. If you've enjoyed this journey, please remember to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring you more long, soothing explorations of history designed to ease you into rest. I'd love to hear from you. Do share in the comments what part of medieval dining you found most surprising, and when you usually listen in. Are you lying in bed at night, drifting off to sleep? Or are you listening during a quiet moment in the day? Hearing from you helps guide future stories and reminds us that history connects us all across time and place. Now, as you close your eyes and let your mind wander, imagine the flicker of torchlight in a great hall, or the quiet bubbling of a pottage pot by the hearth. Let those images carry you into rest, knowing that you've walked, if only in thought, through a world where every bite was survival. Good night, and may history guide you gently into sleep.